Well, good evening, everyone. How are you doing today? That's good. My name is John Mann. I'm Director of Education for Lakeside. And for this evening, we are fortunate to have Vernon Bingham with us during the biggest week in birding. This evening's talk, the Lake Erie Landscape and the Flight Behavior of Migratory Birds, will explore the data that Vernon and his students at BGSU have recorded concerning the flight directions of migratory birds as they approach the Ohio coast of Lake Erie, as well as when they fly over the island chain of the Western Basin. The flight directions recorded suggest that migrants can actively change their flight directions, especially during spring migration, indicating a sensitivity to the landscape below them and cost-benefit interactions with wind direction. Concerning our presenter, Vern is a distinguished research professor at Bowling Green State University. He earned his PhD in zoology from State University of New York, Albany, and his research focuses on animal navigation and how the brain controls navigational behavior. A quick reminder, we have additional scheduled programs for this week. Tomorrow, Holly Merker will be giving a talk here in Orchestra Hall at 7:30 on ornithotherapy, the power of bird watching. Now, she will also be leading a bird walk. It was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10:30, but if you looked at the weather forecast, it's windy and rainy. So she will be giving that bird walk on Friday morning, 10:30 a.m. from the train station pavilion. And then also on Friday evening, Arthur Pearson of the Roger Torrey Peterson Institute will give a talk on the legacy and inspiration of Roger Torrey Peterson. At the end of this evening's session, I do ask if you would please fill out an evaluation form. They're located as you enter or exit Orchestra Hall. And feel free to, you can give it to me, you can bring it tomorrow, Friday. You can always drop it off the administration front desk. They all find their way to me, and it really helps when it comes to scheduling programs for the future. And lastly, I would ask if you would please mute your cell phone ringers. That's always appreciated. Without further ado, please welcome Vern Bingham.
Thank you, John. Okay. Oh boy, I forgot I have my own microphone here, so you guys should be able to hear me reasonably well. I tend to be very loud. Anyway, this is a real pleasure. I don't really do a lot of these kinds of talks. I've always been kind of amazed by this Lakeside Chautauqua thing. I kind of stumbled on it several years ago when there were harlequin ducks in the bay here over winter, and I showed up and I go, where is this? I've never even heard of this little island of paradise, and I don't completely understand everything that goes on here, but it seems incredibly, incredibly interesting. Before I get started, just to get a sense, how many of you are actually, I heard some of you talking about brown thrashers. I overheard some discussions about what people are seeing. How many of you are active bird watchers, just out of curiosity? And you're here because of the bird watching, or you're here because you're Lakesiders? You're all Lakesiders, okay. So the birds are a convenience. Okay, I kind of get it. I get it, I think. All right, and I have to apologize right off the bat. I kind of blew my knee out last week. So every now and then, things get a little bit rough here. I may have to sit down for a little bit. Huh? No, ice hockey, believe it or not. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get started then. Okay. And again, we'll see. And by the way, feel free to ask questions whenever you want. You don't have to hold your questions. So if there's something that's really compelling that you're completely distracted because you want an answer to a question, don't hesitate to interrupt me. That's not a big deal. But okay. Oh, okay. I guess that's the start. Is that the starting thing? The starting signal? I feel like I'm at a racetrack. Anyway, we're going to start our conversation today talking first about a kind of case study, just to kind of contextualize what, in my opinion, is truly remarkable about bird migration, and that, of course, is the bird's navigation abilities. And we're going to look at a somewhat charismatic species in northwest Ohio, the lark sparrow. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the lark sparrow, but the most eastern breeding population of the lark sparrow is in the Oak Openings region. I mean, it's kind of a weird little place. It's really a western species of bird. And about 10 years ago, I was involved in a research project that was intended to kind of explore how successful these birds are in returning to the same field year after year. In other words, establishing this sense of navigation, this sense of space which is so robust in these migratory birds. All right, so let's kind of begin here and see where we're going and as the lights go out. So again, here's the lark sparrow. Just to give you a sense of its breeding range, you could see that it is basically a plains species of bird. It likes grasslands and the plains. You have this one little population in northwest Ohio. To the right, oh, you don't have a pointer, do you, by any chance? Do you have a pointer? If not, we'll figure it out. And to the right is kind of the typical breeding habitats. If you go out to Nebraska or Kansas or something like that, that's where you would expect to see lark sparrows. But here in northwest Ohio, they live in these nice little fields in the oak openings, right? A little bit greener, a little bit more lush, okay? And it is a reasonably large population. Oh, okay, I see what you're doing. Let me see, is there something in there? Oh, wow, we're in business. Okay, perfect. Look at that, guys, we're in business. So again, very much greener, much more lush habitat. Again, for the bird watchers in the room, these little Girdham Road sand dunes. These aren't the sand dunes but nearby, but this is where you get things like blue grosbeak, summer tanager, blue-winged warbler. Chat can breed there. It's really just a really pretty excellent place. Okay, so some of these slides are going to be a little bit too busy to have a real conversation, but just give you a sense of what's going on. This was work I did with a graduate student named Jeremy Ross, and you really don't have to spend a whole lot of time wondering about this. But for several years, Jeremy would color band these lark sparrows, right? So each individual would be caught in a mist net, and they would have a unique combination of these colors so they could be identified in subsequent years. And what Jeremy was interested in, among many other things, was how many of these birds come back from year after year after year. I mean, again, let me remind you, I mean, this little field where these birds are breeding, okay, is not much bigger than a handful of football fields. Right? And these are birds that are known to go to Mexico for the winter. Okay? So they color banded them, and there's some numbers here. But if you look at this, over a period from 2005 to 2008, from one year to the next, about 65% of the males return. Right? By contrast, about 57% of the females return. Okay, again, these are birds that are sighted. It may very well be that those numbers are bigger because Jeremy didn't see them or didn't catch them in the net or something like that. But the point I want to make is that despite their substantial migrations into central Mexico, these birds are able to find this little field in northwest Ohio year after year after year. And if that's not, yeah. Okay, so Jeremy has caught birds 3 or 4 or 5 years, up to that. Okay, so I would guess on average 3 years, 3 to 4 years, if they survive their first migration. The first migration is usually the one that has the highest mortality. So if the birds come back their second year, they're very likely to come back a third and fourth year. But it's that first year mortality which is really substantial, right? Is really substantial. Okay, but as a navigation person, I was actually more interested in knowing where these birds go. And so I persuaded Jeremy to work with me on this project where we employed these weird little things that are called geologgers. And again, I won't go into too much detail here, right? But these are devices that can approximate a bird's position. Okay, relying on day length, believe it or not. It's not super precise, but it's actually pretty good. So Jeremy and I, we collected 21 lark sparrows, and we deployed these geologgers that had a memory chip attached to them, so they had a little solar panel to provide energy. And there's a memory chip that recorded their position from one day to the next day to the next day. And then 1 year later, you try to get them back. Okay? Right? Which is really quite an adventure. But just to give you a sense, of the 21 birds that we attached the geologger to in the 1 year, 10 of those were resighted. Okay? About 6 or 7 of those were actually able to get into the net. Okay? And about 3 of those, the geologger actually worked. So let's take a look at those 3 birds, shall we? So we take a look at those 3 birds. Okay, and this is actually quite remarkable. Okay? So you're able to reconstruct the flight paths, okay, of these birds. So just to give you a sense, the gold coloring is the fall, the green coloring is the spring migration, okay, and we have 5 tracks. For whatever reason, for this male 2, the geologger broke. Okay, and just give you a sense of what's going on. So these birds do go into the central plains of Mexico. Again, the geologger gave up here. Okay, and they come back. You can see here they coming right. Look at coming right back, coming right back. This guy, we don't know if he comes back or not. And what was also interesting about this is kind of a side note that I don't want to spend too much time on. But what Jeremy was also interested in is something called molt migration. For many, many birds out west, they will begin to migrate and then stop and take advantage of the August monsoons, say in Arizona and Mexico, when then there's a flush of resources to carry out the very energetically expensive molt. This is what is referred to as molt migration. And out west, lark sparrows are a typical molt migration species. They will begin their migration in July, then they'll stop, okay, take advantage of this flush of resources because of the monsoons, and then resume their migration after this period of molt. So the question was, well, what about these eastern breeding lark sparrows? They don't have to go into a molt migration. There's plenty of food around here all the time. But what Jeremy was very excited about is that these two males, right, here and here, both actually began their migrations and then suspended their migrations, presumably expressing this notion of molt migration, which is kind of interesting. So for example, you look at male 1, it left on July 5th. It doesn't show up into Mexico until August 7th. You look at this male 2, leaves July 20th, doesn't show up in Mexico until September 2nd, because they're spending a lot of time, this guy in Arkansas, Texas, this guy more in Nebraska, Missouri. This is kind of interesting. I find it interesting. The female, no. The female, look at the female is 3 weeks done. No molt migration for the one female. And not a huge sample size or anything like that. The point I want to make, however, is as charismatic as the lark sparrow is, it is ordinary in terms of comparisons with other species of migratory birds. They are superb navigators. They routinely return to the same breeding site year after year after year. In fact, the lark sparrow migration is relatively modest. Right? I don't know exactly what it is, but Ohio to central Mexico is not the same kind of thing, for example, as a Swainson's thrush that's breeding in Alaska and goes down to Peru, yet it comes back very close to the same breeding site year after year after year. So there's this navigational ability, this superb navigational ability. Okay? So this superb navigational ability kind of conflicts with some older principles from bird migration research. Okay? So let's kind of look at those for a second. You guys may be familiar with these canonical migratory pathways, right? If you know a little bit about bird migration. The Atlantic pathway, the Mississippi pathway, the Plains pathway, the Pacific pathway. These have historically been identified, and they're primarily discussed in the context of waterfowl, but not exclusively waterfowl. And you know, where birds will follow these particular routes very, very carefully, right? They all have this kind of faithful, this fidelity to these particular routes, and every bird is doing the same thing, right? They're all following these different pathways. If I could just share with you a side note here very quickly. What's so unique about Northwest Ohio and why we're so special in terms of bird migration in the spring is that we are kind of at the confluence of the Atlantic flyway and the Mississippi flyway. They kind of come together here. It doesn't look like it on this image, but they kind of come close together here. So you have these two separate pathways. They're kind of feeding into each other and coming into Northwest Ohio, which is kind of neat. Right? So the idea, what emerges from these pathways, okay, is that these migrants are relatively passive navigators. They have a direction, they fly in a particular direction, and they kind of fly together without any kind of, you know, any real individual variation of anything. Of course, again, it's a contradiction because they all have their own little breeding sites. Okay, so reinforcing this idea of broad front migration and migratory pathways. What I mean by broad front migration is the birds all kind of flying together in one direction. Is research that's been carried out using these Doppler weather stations, looking at migratory birds. Okay, just give you so this is, again, we're looking at broad front migration. So these Doppler weather stations were probably installed in the mid-1990s, I'm guessing. Feel free to contradict me if I'm wrong. Okay, and of course they're designed to detect weather, they're designed to detect precipitation. But what was discovered relatively soon was not only do these Doppler radar stations pick up precipitation, but they also pick up migratory birds. So what you're looking at here is a kind of a running video of these targets, okay, or this movement patterns around the Doppler weather station in Cleveland. And the way you read these things is that green, if it's green, that means it's moving towards the radar site. If it's red, it's moving away from the radar site. And again, this is not precipitation. These are migratory, and principally migratory songbirds, flying on a fall night, kind of in a southwesterly direction, which would not be peculiar in this kind of place. Right? So again, you have this impression of tens of thousands of birds, caught up in a particular weather system, all of them more or less moving in the same direction. Right? More or less moving in the same direction. Okie dokie. Okay, again, and you could actually, if you ever play with this, if you ever go to Birdcast, how many are familiar with Birdcast? Right, so it predicts what's going on, and you get these kinds of maps. Yeah, and this is all based on the Doppler radar data, right? So all these little dots are stations, and you could see on this night, whenever it was, this was May of 2022, you have a pretty large migration moving up the Mississippi Flyway, right? Whereas probably there was bad weather, or there was bad weather on the Atlantic coast. There's not much going on here, but so you could get these kind of global patterns of movement based on, again, so we have a radar station in Detroit, Fort Wayne, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Buffalo, places like that. So again, so these birds are kind of up there migrating and migrating and migrating and doing their thing. Okay. All right, that's really kind of interesting. So again, so what I'm going to, so kind of our departure point here, there's a sort of I want to just sensitize you to a sort of paradox, right? Migration is necessarily an individual experience. It is necessarily an individual phenomenon. This lark sparrow is ending up in this field, okay? So even though it might be migrating at night in this mass of songbirds, thrushes, warblers, vireos, okay? Somehow this bird is unique in terms of its flight path because it's going to end up here, and none of those other birds are going to end up there, right? So again, you have these general patterns, these averages, if I could use that term. But these averages of the birds moving all more or less in the same direction. But embedded in that generalization, right, embedded in that shared kind of directionality has to be the uniqueness of each bird's migratory journey, each bird's own navigational ability. Okey-doke. This walking helps me, by the way. Okay, so let's take a detour for a second. This is actually what I spent a good chunk of my career studying. So let's look at the mechanisms that enable these birds to navigate. And what I want to make distinctive for you, and this is actually quite important, is the distinction between a directional sense and a compass sense, okay, and a map sense or a positional sense. So let's play with this for a second. Let's first look at compasses, and these are well known and well described. And again, and I should emphasize this, and I apologize for not mentioning this earlier, but I'm emphasizing nocturnal migratory songbirds. I'm not thinking about ducks or shorebirds or things like swallows that might migrate during the day, but just vireos, warblers, thrushes, on and on and on. That's what I'm referring to. So let's take a look at this. So these are nocturnal migrating birds. How are they able to identify a somewhat northerly direction in the spring for their spring migration or a somewhat southerly direction in the fall for their fall migration? So they have, although these are nocturnal migrants, they can rely on the position of the setting sun. So as these birds prepare to engage on their migration, take up for a migratory flight for a particular night, they can actually use the position of the setting sun as a directional cue. As we transition from sunset to the evening, now the birds can rely on the stars. Okay? It's a really elegant mechanism how they learn to use this. As young birds, they actually see the rotation of the night sky, and they actually find the rotation point, which would be Polaris, in the night sky, and they kind of use that as a reference, right? The point of rotation of the stars. It's a very dynamic learning process that these young birds go through. Okay? But not every night is a clear night. Birds migrate even on cloudy nights. What are they going to rely on when they can't see the stars? Okay? Well, they also have a geomagnetic compass. Right? Now, again, I won't get into the weeds here. It's not the same kind of magnetic compass that you would use going out into the woods, right? But it is a compass that relies on their ability to detect the Earth's magnetic field, in particular distinguish between the north magnetic pole and the south magnetic pole, and they actually use that to carry out go off in a particular direction. So these nocturnal migratory songbirds have a rich toolbox of sensory mechanisms that they can rely on to go off in a northerly direction in spring and a southerly direction in fall. But let me ask you a question. Okay? Let's say I give you a compass, okay? and I blindfold you, and I put you in my car, and I drive somewhere where you've never been before, okay? And I throw you outside, I take the blindfold off, and I give you a compass, and I say, okay, find your way home. Would you be able to find your way home if I only gave you a compass? No, absolutely not, because you have no idea where you are in relation to your goal, right? So if you're here in Lakeside, if I blindfold you, or I could take you east or south or west, right? I can't take you north, really, you'd hear the boat, okay? The compass will tell you where east, west, and south is, or north, but it will not tell you where you are, so it is useless. So for this navigation ability, truly what's the most extraordinary thing is that they have some kind of map, a positional sense, right? These birds are actually able to detect where they are in relation to their goal, and that's a remarkable ability. Now, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that, so I'm going to describe an experiment that I did not do. I wish I did. Okay, to give you a sense of the distinction, the role of learning and experience. So this is a white-crowned sparrow. You've probably seen a few of these the past few days. Huh? Oh, yes, you do, in winter. Right, and look at that. We're going to be talking about that. Don't get upset what I'm about to share with you, though. It's not a big deal. Okay. So what I'm going to be highlighting in the next 5 minutes, okay, is the distinction between a really just a kind of simplistic heuristic, a rule that first-time migratory birds use to kind of find their way home, and a sophisticated map that these birds learn as a consequence of their migratory experience. Okay? All right, so here's the experiment. So this is the breeding range of the white-crowned sparrow, okay? And in the western Rocky Mountains, and the birds typically fly in this direction, so the birds are breeding here. They'll typically migrate through Washington, Oregon, California to overwinter in California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, as well as Mexico. Fine. Okay, so these are birds that typically have never gone east of the Rocky Mountains. Okay? The birds that we get here are the ones that are breeding up here, right? They're migrating and they're going up here. These are coming down this way. So what the researchers did in this experiment is they captured white-crowned sparrows, and I can't imagine anything sadder than this. They put them in a box, and they flew them to New Jersey. Okay, like I said, hopefully, it's actually Princeton, which is pretty nice, but having grown up in New York, I just have this imagery of the New Jersey Turnpike around Newark and places like that. What a hellhole that is to wake up there, leaving the Cascade Mountains of Washington and ending up in here. Here's the important point. These birds have never been to New Jersey before. Never. And you have two types of birds. Okay? The bluebirds are adult birds. These are birds that are 2 years old or 3 years old. They've already migrated. They've already successfully returned to the southwestern United States. The redbirds, okay, are the birds on their first migration. So this is fall, and these are birds that were born that summer. They had never migrated before. And here's the question. If you possess a real navigational map, what that navigational map enables is what we can refer to as a corrective reorientation. Fancy terminology. What the hell does it mean? What it means is that if you're displaced away from your familiar route, you can correct for that displacement and basically compute a new route to your goal location, which would be here in Arizona. Okay? Alternatively, what these birds may simply know is fly south for a certain amount of time and stop when you feel like stopping. Not particularly sophisticated, not something you would call navigation. All right, so these birds are taken here in New Jersey, and then little radio telemetry devices are placed on their back. So you're actually able to follow them for about a week, right? So they follow them when they were in a van. These researchers were in a van. They were in an airplane. They let the birds go. All right, so let's first take a look at the adult birds. So they're released in Princeton, New Jersey. These are the flight paths that were recorded using this miniature telemetry, okay? And we could kind of sum it up here, that what you could see, so each of these little triangles is one bird, its direction after a certain amount of time. And what you could see is, as a group, these birds actually, when released in New Jersey, flew off in this west-southwesterly direction. Hey, guess what? You've already figured this out. You're a clever group, right? That's exactly the direction the birds would take to reach New Mexico and Arizona. they successfully carried out what we call a corrective reorientation. It's a true map. It's a true navigational map. You take them to a place where they've never been to before, right? And they're able to use some kind of memory-based, learning-based representation of global space to head off in the appropriate direction. Just as a side note, there was one exception, this bird that wanted to go to Atlantic City first. Okay? But you can see that after this bird went to Atlantic City, it then went on its merry way in the direction of Arizona. Now contrast this with the young birds. Okay? These are the red guys. What you can see is that they're flying south. Okay? And you can see that here, all of them are flying in a southerly direction. What that means is that these first-year migrants have yet to acquire, they have yet to learn what we call a navigational map. What these young birds have is kind of a genetic program, an inherited program. I won't go into the details, but it's something that we call vector navigation in the field. And what that means is simply this. These birds have an innate program and a genetic program that tells them on their first migration, fly this direction for this amount of time, and you're going to get somewhere that is reasonable as an overwintering habitat. But during this simplistic first navigational flight, you're learning about the environment, you're learning about how environmental cues are changing, okay, such that in subsequent migrations you can transition from this unlearned genetic program of navigation to one that involves actually a real map, right, this transition. I find that fascinating, right? And we'll come back to this a little bit in a second. Okay, all right? Okay, if you've got any questions, just give me a shout. All right, so again, the question you're asking yourself is, okay, well, you were pretty clear on the sensory mechanisms that enable the animals their sense of direction, setting sun, stars, Earth's magnetic field. I'm confused. What could possibly be in the environment, okay, that would enable these birds in New Jersey to figure out that they were, what am I looking for? So east, northeast of Arizona. I mean, how is that even possible if they've never been east of the Rocky Mountains? And this is a long and complicated story. And what this slide, and this is Swainson's thrush, by the way, but what this slide is intended just to show you is that there's not probably one navigational map, but multiple navigational maps. And again, I don't want to bore you too much with this little graph right here, but the idea is that when birds, in the case of the Swainson's thrush, overwintering in Peru, and then breeding in Toronto, where they don't breed anyway, so forgive me, but I needed something symbolic. So there you have it. Right? The idea is that they begin their migration, they rely on a navigational mechanism that of a large scale, right? It's a scale of thousands of kilometers. There's information over thousands of kilometers. But it's not terribly accurate. As if you're a Swainson's thrush in Ecuador, you just have to stay close to your migratory pathway, right? Until you get closer and there's more information available to you. Okay? So the idea is they take off and they rely on this crude map, and then they get closer, so they get into the Great Lakes, and they transition to a different map that has smaller spatial resolution, but higher accuracy. It's more predictable. And then they get closer, and they can rely on visual landmarks. So the idea, okay, is that this remarkable navigation ability is not grounded in a single map, but multiple maps that vary with respect to resolution and accuracy. Excuse me, that's the same thing, distance, right? A large-scale map of low accuracy or a small-scale map of high accuracy. That's the idea. Okay, okie dokie, okie dokie. So just to do this, again, believe it or not, and this is different, okay, but there is some evidence, and I won't go into that because that's not really what I'm intended to talking about here, but there's some evidence that the birds can also rely on variation in the Earth's magnetic field as part of their map sense. I don't want to get too much into the geophysics of this, but what this map is showing you is that there are two parameters of the Earth's magnetic field that vary predictably, okay, in somewhat different directions, kind of north-south. They're both kind of north-south, but not exactly the same thing. So let me just point these out to you very, very briefly. The first thing I want you to do is look at these little arrows, right? You see these little arrows. So this is actually the arrows, the direction that the magnetic field is pointing, right? So this is one magnetic pole, and this is another magnetic pole. And again, I'm now distracted myself, but I've gone down this rabbit hole. I'm going to keep going, okay? So the magnetic poles are not the geographic poles, right? So the North Magnetic Pole is somewhere in Baffin Island or near Baffin Island in Canada, and the South Magnetic Pole is somewhere out here in the middle of flippin' nowhere. I have no idea. Bottom line is this, right? That the magnetic field is stronger near the magnetic poles and weaker at the magnetic equator. So this white line is the magnetic equator, again, which is not the same as our geographic equator. So if a bird can detect the Earth's magnetic field and detect the intensity, right, it could actually know how far it is relative to the geomagnetic poles depending on the strength of the magnetic field. Strong magnetic field, I must be near the poles. Weak magnetic field, I must be near the equator. There's a second dimension of the Earth's magnetic field called inclination. It's the angle. So the Earth's magnetic field, it's not like your compass needle. It actually goes into the Earth. And the angle it makes as it enters the Earth varies. So again, at the magnetic poles, the magnetic field lines are vertical to the Earth's surface. At the equator, the magnetic field lines are horizontal to the Earth's surface. And they vary then as you drift from the equator to the poles. So if you could read this angle, you can also gauge where you are along a roughly north-south axis. All right. Sorry about that, but once I started, I couldn't stop myself. Okay, but what I am interested in is, okay, part is looking at this remarkable Northwest Ohio and its topography in Lake Erie, and the extent to which these like local visual features, these local landscape topographic features, may be exploited by migratory birds. So I just want to give you a different context here, right? Because this is a study I did many, many years ago, the Hudson Valley, right? So it's kind of a linear landmark. If you've ever been to upstate New York, somewhere between New York City and Albany, right? The Hudson River kind of runs. It's not straight, but from the sky, if you ever fly over the Hudson River, it's just this black line that kind of splits one side of the Hudson Valley from the other side of the Hudson Valley. So what we did is that we recorded the directions of birds. Okay, and we're looking at mean nightly directions here. Along the Hudson Valley, as well as a place away from the Hudson Valley, All right, so why don't you look at these other winds? In central New York, the typical migration is to the southwest, right? So this is the outer circle dots are the Hudson Valley directions, and the inner circle is the control site away from the river, okay? And that's fine. But what I want to highlight here is westerly winds. We're going to talk more about this later, but westerly winds are drifting winds. Remember, these birds are aloft, okay? And they have a particular heading, and we'll look at this a little bit more carefully in a second. They have a particular direction they want to fly, so they're going to orient themselves, say, to the southwest. But if there's strong westerly winds, the actual movement of the birds over the ground will be more southeasterly, right? You just have to add the vectors, and we're going to look at this in a second. So it's not shocking that with strong westerly winds, the birds away from the river are heading more southeast because they're being drifted by those winds. But take a look at what they're doing on the river. On the river, with nights of westerly winds, they're still able to maintain a south-southwesterly migratory direction. In other words, if you have the Hudson River as a leading line, something you can visually detect, right, to kind of correct for drift, change your heading. Notice these birds are actually changing their headings. They're not pointed southwest, they're pointed more west, right? But as a consequence of the winds, they're moving in a southwesterly direction. This is a remarkable ability. These are birds that are up there migrating, okay? And they're able to detect that they're being drifted by the winds, and when offered a linear landmark, in this case a north-south oriented linear landmark, they can exploit that linear landmark to carry out a change in their direction of heading, the way their head is pointed, to keep up their preferred direction. That's remarkable, guys, right? That's remarkable. These birds are actually understanding atmospheric physics in a very simple sense, right? They're detecting that being drifted by the winds, and they're able to carry out this compensatory response. All right, now, moving on. So just to give you a sense, again, this is this wind drift figure. I just want to give you a sense of what's going on. So this would be a bird, okay? And this is the bird's heading, okay? And this is where it wants to go, right? So the bird is here, and it wants to go to this goal location. And it's headed in that direction, right? The goal location is east. I'm going to point east. But since there are southwesterly winds, the track, the actual movement of the bird will be this. In other words, it's drifting. It's drifting north of the direction of the goal. And that's what those birds seem to be doing in the Hudson Valley that are not near the river, where they don't have that leading line to correct for their orientation. By contrast, if you're along the Hudson River, okay, you actually then alter your heading. You see this? You see the bird is actively altering its heading. So now it's pointed towards, let's call it southeast, but because the winds are coming from the southwest, the actual movement of the bird will be in the direction of the goal. You see this? You see the change in heading? It changes. The river enables the bird to assess this drift and compensate for this drift by changing its heading such that its track, how it's moving over the ground, is in the appropriate goal-directed direction. Goal-directed direction. That doesn't sound elegant. Okay, moving on. Okay, so Lake Erie and its island archipelago. Right? There's been a long-standing interest, again, because we have huge amounts of migratory birds in the area. And Lake Erie represents what we might call a topographical barrier. Okay? Now, I was actually talking to a local ornithologist last week that said, these birds are coming up here and they see this lake and they freeze. Lake Erie is not that big of a deal, right? It's about 30, 40 miles across. A migratory bird with the right winds can manage that in an hour, right? But it is an obstacle, and it is a potential source of danger. Okay? And there's some data out there that say that at least some migratory birds, although not so much nocturnal birds, will exploit the island archipelago, right? So Point Pelee in Canada and our islands here as they cross, okay, to kind of stay near land should things get ugly, okay? But the bottom line is this, okay? But we're going to look at spring first. So you have the spring migration. These birds are migrating up, and they're going to hit Lake Erie. And the idea is, are they passive? Do they just simply keep going? Or are they, again, able to make some kind of individual assessment of the cost benefits, whether it's worthwhile to cross the lake or not cross the lake, and things like that? Okay, so this was the PhD thesis of a graduate student named David Gizicki, and I apologize for what I'm going to be sharing with you here. So what he relied on was the Doppler radar, so he got broad front directions from Cleveland Doppler radar. And he also relied on the infrared camera like this. So he's actually looking at individual birds. Okay, so let me be clear here. He's looking at individual migrants using these infrared cameras. Okay? Using these infrared cameras. So he's getting individual directions. So he's getting both global patterns of movement and individual patterns of movement. Okay, so this is what you see. Do you see it? Pay attention. Woo, this is what you see through the infrared camera on a night. Okay, I'm not sure it's going to change anyone's life, but there it is, right? A migratory bird seen through an infrared camera. Wow, bet you weren't expecting that. Okay, so here we are. So again, just to give you a sense of where he's working. So he had four observation sites where he took individual bearings. Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, Cedar Point National Wildlife Refuge, not to be confused with the Cedar Point Amusement Park. Okay, Maumee Bay, okay, and Bowling Green. So this is away from the lake shore. And he also relied on the Doppler recorder. So this, again, we're getting individual directions here. He also relied on Doppler radar, okay, to pick up, again, broad front, collective directional tendencies. I'm just out of curiosity. Does anyone know what time it is? Just out of curiosity. 7:40, boy. The fun never ends. Here we go. All right, so again, what you have to imagine, this is a daytime picture, but again, we're looking at nocturnal migratory songbirds. Imagine they're coming up and they're hitting the lake, and it could be not a big deal. Because again, for example, these nocturnal songbirds, even hummingbirds will cross the Gulf of Mexico, okay? Right, just put this in context. That's a water crossing of several hundred miles, right? Lake Erie, 30, 40 miles, right? Kid stuff. But, and this is well documented, Lake Erie is also subject to improvise is not the right word, but sudden changes of weather, violent weather, okay? So even if you're only in the middle of Lake Erie, if a weather system comes in like this, you're doomed. You're done. Right? There are some documented cases, for example, of storms in Lake Michigan that have killed tens of thousands of birds, right? Because they were caught over Lake Michigan when this kind of just spontaneous storm kind of came through, a front comes through or something like that. Okay? So even though crossing Lake Erie is not necessarily an energetic challenge, in other words, you don't burning up a lot of fuel to cross Lake Erie, that you might crossing, for example, the Gulf of Mexico. Okay? When these birds land, for example, in spring, these birds land on the islands outside of Mississippi and Alabama. I don't know if you've been down there, but these are beautiful islands. I forgot what they're called, but these birds are exhausted. They're down to nothing when they land. There is real threats of weather. Birds die crossing Lake Erie. Okay? Birds die crossing Lake Erie. Okay, David, what do you got for me? Okay, again, I apologize. This is kind of busy slides. And this slide is actually not the most important. Okay. Whoop. Oh, here we go. This is not the most. So again, and I apologize for this, but each of these dots out here is the direction of a single bird. These dots here is the average for a single night. So there's a redundancy between these two. They're not exactly saying the same thing, but for our purposes, they are. Right? And this is the Doppler. So for the first year that David did this, right, he was interested in seeing, okay, whether or not the directions along the western basin of Lake Erie differed from the overall directions in the area. And that's true. Check this out, guys. So if you look at the Doppler recordings, the birds are mostly going north, a little bit east of north. Fine. But there is a tendency of the birds in Cedar Point and Ottawa. So this is this little background, right? So at Cedar Point, the land is oriented in this direction. And you can see that the birds are kind of paralleling the orientation of Cedar Point. This is Ottawa, kind of the same thing, not quite as dramatic. But there were clearly the first order analysis, the first thing that David discovered, okay, was that in fact these birds seem to be doing something different. Now, you're a bright group. I just want to emphasize one thing. There is an elevational confound. What do I mean by that? The infrared cameras tend to be able to detect birds up to about 1,000 feet, right? Whereas the Doppler radar is getting at them at 2,000, 3,000 feet. So they're not necessarily sampling the same layers of migration. Okay? I'll simply tell you that you don't have to worry about that. But in the spirit of full disclosure, you now know. Okay, so this is actually what's fascinating. Okay, let's kind of deconstruct this. And let's just look at this. Okay, so this is a different year. Okay, so first of all, let's look at Cedar Point. And what we can see at Cedar Point is that there's a tendency of the bird. Look at this. A subset of the birds. Okay, so to be clear, many birds are crossing Lake Erie. Many birds are crossing Lake Erie. But a subset of the birds have chosen on some nights to actually fly parallel to the coast. You see this pulse here? Maumee Bay, where the orientation of the coastline is east-west, in other words, doesn't lead in the direction of their movement, right? Okay. So this is kind of at least leading you in a northerly direction. Maumee Bay does not. Nothing. Bowling Green, nothing. So these are kind of the same data. These are all individual bearings. And clearly something is going on at Cedar Point that is not going on at Maumee Bay and at Bowling Green. The conclusion is that a substantial number of migratory birds, when reaching the coast of Lake Erie, there's kind of a binary decision. A binary decision. Just keep going, or let's just kind of drift and parallel the coastline, and so such that if things turn ugly, right, we could find a landfall relatively quickly. And that's what's going on here. So you have individual variations. First, you have an assessment going on. These birds need to be assessing whether or not it's advantageous to cross or to parallel, right? And it seems to be an individual decision. It seems to be an individual decision. Whoa. Okay, now the next slide should be pretty dramatic. Okay, I'll talk about this energetics. Let's take a look at this westerly winds. Now remember, in westerly winds, it's going to be costly to migrate and parallel the coast, right? Then you're going into the wind, which is energetically exhausting. So with westerly winds, there's actually an energetic disadvantage in paralleling the coastline, And what David discovered and again, this is pretty damn impressive, is that if you look at easterly winds, winds that would push the birds in the direction along the coast, there's a strong tendency for these birds to move parallel to the coastline, both at Cedar Point and at Ottawa. But when the winds shift to the west, take a look at this, guys. Come on. This is worth coming here for, don't you think? Look at that difference. They're saying, no, I'm not, no. Okay, I understand that I'm going out over the lake, and it's risky out there, it's dangerous, but if I switch and parallel the coast, I killed the battery on this thing, if I switch and parallel the coast, well, there it is, still there, sort of. Oh, there it is. If I switch and parallel the coast with westerly winds, it's going to be energetically devastating. Right? These birds are on an energy budget. They cannot overdo it. So that's really remarkable. Guys, this is something you want to remember. Okay, this is something you want to remember. Look at that. That's really extraordinary. Okay, so that's the spring. How about the fall? This is actually another graduate student. And I think I'm going to keep this story short. In the fall, you have a very different profile. Okay? In the fall, you have a very different profile. The different profile is that, first of all, these birds are reaching the Ohio coast of Lake Erie, actually having already crossed the lake, right? They left Canada, right? So they're not coming to the shore and making a decision. They've already made a decision. So you're looking at birds that have already decided to cross Lake Erie, okay? And generally speaking, the birds are moving more or less in the same direction at Maumee Bay, at Cedar Point, the Doppler, if you look at the Doppler radar, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference. There doesn't seem to be much of a difference. And again, that kind of makes sense because these are birds that have already left the coast. But there's something else I want to share with you that I think is fascinating. Okay, so the fall is not so interesting. Okay, and again, this is the broad front. So you're looking at Cleveland, Ottawa, Cedar Point, again, where there were robust differences during the spring. Again, these birds reaching the coast and making a decision. There's no differences seemingly going on in the fall. Okay? So hopefully the next slide will lead me to my story. Will you believe it? Yes, it does. There's something else about the fall, okay, which brings us back to something we talked about earlier. There are estimates that up to 80% of the birds that are migrating in the fall are first-year birds, right? First-year birds, 80%. And if you're ever near the Atlantic coast or the Pacific coast, sometimes you see migratory birds in fall in weird places. So this is a lighthouse in Maine. Okay, on one particular night, you have, if you look at this carefully, there must be at least a dozen different species of warbler that have landed on this light tower. Out west in the Pacific coast, this is a Townsend's warbler that landed on a boat, a sailboat out in the Pacific. Okay. So remember, these young birds are birds that do not have a sophisticated navigational mechanism, right? They're relying on this sense of direction and time to guide their navigation, right? This direction, a sense of time to guide their navigation. So it may well be that at least part of what's going on in the fall here is because these birds, for lack of it, aren't clever enough to exploit the underlying topography to carry out changes, right? Because a lot of them are just naive. They haven't really learned about the local topography. They haven't learned to integrate map information with topographical information. Something along those lines. I mean, I'm being admittedly vague, and I apologize for that. But here we are. Okay, so now what about this island archipelago? So this is actually the work, this is a master's thesis that was just completed by a graduate student named Murphy Harrington. And so let's talk about this. And again, we approached this. So she was set up on Middle Bass Island. Okay? So she was recording using the infrared cameras to look at directions of birds on Middle Bass Island, and the control location was Bowling Green. So you have the island archipelago. And I went into this with the expectation that these islands would effectively be like a, what's the word I'm looking for? It would be the opposite of the Hudson River, in the sense that the Hudson River is kind of the leading line surrounded by land. And the idea here is that the islands would be the leading line surrounded by water. Right? What happens when you inverse the image? It's the negative, right? It's a photographic negative. Okay. So my expectation was to see some kind of reliance on the island archipelago, at the very least, to compensate for the drifting effects of wind. Okay, so there's Murphy. She had a little bit of a different camera. This is actually fancier. This is her little field station on Middle Bass Island. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at spring. Don't worry about the statistics and stuff like that. This is actually fascinating. I did not expect this, right? But you could see here, if you look at these directions, if you look at Middle Bass Island, again, each of these dots is a single bird. And there's more birds out here in kind of the west-northwest compared to here, right? You can compare the mean directions, 349. This mean direction is over here a little bit more, right? It's kind of interesting because there's more over there. Okay, so these are actually, if anyone cares, and I don't, but statistically reliably different from each other, right? What that means is this, how I interpret this, that even out in the lake, so I don't know how far Middle Bass Island is from the coast, maybe 5 miles. Anyone here? Are there any mariners in the room that know? Closer to 10. But those birds also, even out over the islands, at least a subset of the birds are deciding to parallel the coast, right? They're deciding to parallel the coast. I don't know why that is, but there's certainly that clear tendency. There's that clear tendency, okay? There's that clear tendency. All right, I'm almost done, guys. Patience, patience. Now let's take a look at spring. Okay, more spring. I want to highlight this, okay? And this is Middle Bass Island. This is Bowling Green, and these are nightly mean directions. So you're looking at the average for a single night. So there's 10, 15 birds. You take the average and see what they look like. And what I want to highlight is that this impression that at least some nights these birds are choosing to parallel the coast is indicated by here. You see these four? These are 4 nights when the birds are clearly more westerly on Middle Bass Island compared to Bowling Green, right? So what this is telling you is that this westerly tendency on Middle Bass Island is going to be contingent on some energetic factor. I don't know what it is. Murphy didn't really break it down. I suspect maybe with easterly winds you're going to get more of this kind of flight. I don't really know that. But again, the idea is, again, these guys are active agents. They're making an assessment of the weather, risks, and relying on this local topography. And that's what these little red dots are telling you. These little red dots are telling you right there. Okay, if you look at the fall, again, there isn't a whole lot here, but I want to highlight something, and I apologize for this because this gets a little bit too much into the weeds. But see this number 75 and this number 67? These are indicators of how tightly the birds are oriented, right? It gives you a sense of how much spread there is in the birds. A bigger number means there's less spread. Less spread. Okay? This is not a statistically reliable difference, but nonetheless, even in the fall, you seem to be getting less spread on Middle Bass Island compared to Bowling Green. Less spread. That's consistent with the idea with at least a subset of the birds, maybe the adult birds, the 20% of the adult birds, that can be exploiting the island archipelago to compensate for wind drift, as I've kind of expected. Again, it's not a demonstration, but it's kind of close to that. This next slide is a little bit ugly. No, it's not. It's actually pretty pretty. Okay. Okay. Right, and this is simply saying not much of effect going on, although again, seems to be more spread. Again, 74 versus 79, more spread at Bowling Green. This is kind of interesting. I realize these dots are probably blinding you now. But again, we did look at westerly winds, right? During fall. On westerly winds, Middle Bass Island, you have 89. That's how tight. These are nightly mean directions. So from night to night, there's not a lot of variation in the directional tendency of the birds over Middle Bass Island. By contrast, if you look at Bowling Green, 0.75, that's a difference of about 0.14. It's not statistically reliable because the sample sizes are small, that's neither here nor there. But you don't need to be a statistician to see there's much more spread here. You see this spread? Okay. Again, although it lacks statistical confirmation, there clearly is a tendency in the fall where the bearings of the birds as well as the nightly mean directions are tighter over Middle Bass Island compared to Bowling Green. Inference. The inference is that indeed the island archipelago can serve as a reference point, like the Hudson River, to diminish the variation, to enable birds to hold a preferred direction by altering their headings. Okay, by altering their headings. I wish the results were a little bit more robust, but they are what they are. They are what they are. Okay, so, yeah, it's over. So what have we learned? I'm not sure. That's for you to decide. But if I could whisper just two things in your ear before I end here, is the following. Before I forget, because I always do this, I want to make sure that I thank Ohio Sea Grant that funded this research. Right? This is administered through Ohio State University. They do a lot of water quality work. Birds is a little bit outside of their portfolio, okay, to be honest with you. But they saw the potential in doing some bird research, and they were very generous in giving us money to support the research, because I tend to forget these things. So again, this was Ohio Sea Grant, so I want to thank them very much. But anyway, going back to this, if you're someone like me, right, and you look at this the behavior of these migratory birds over Lake Erie, one can't help but be struck by the reality that these migratory birds are up there, and I consider them active agents. In other words, they are perceptually and cognitively, they are both seeing and thinking about the relationship between their goal, the local topography, and the local weather conditions. They are making cost-benefit assessments and making decisions, cross the lake, don't cross the lake, parallel the lake, don't parallel the lake, which is extraordinary. What that implies, of course, is that they have a brain that enables them to do that. Again, really, most of the research I do looks at different brain structures in birds and how those brain structures enable this robust sense of space, right? And for me, that's fascinating, okay? Because again, this is a picture, again, you guys probably don't follow this, but actually this would be a good topic for people for this week, next week. But there certainly has been a revolution in how we perceive bird intelligence, right? If you look at the textbook understanding of bird intelligence from 40 years ago, birds were stupid, right? They laid eggs, they sat on, they did stupid things. But the last 40 years has seen an absolute revolution in our understanding of the remarkable learning, thinking, problem-solving, decision-making, navigating abilities of birds, all based on learning and generalizing from that learning to novel situations. And again, for me, and again, what's been shown is that the organization of birds, and a crow is the biggest brain, okay, is not terribly different from primates. In other words, whatever primate intelligence is, whatever intelligence you want to assign to a primate, crows and other birds are at that same level. And that makes sense if you're going to be reading this and making decisions and stuff like that in the context of navigation. And that's really a fun topic, the bird intelligence. And then finally, again, I've kind of lost track of this, but part of the motivation behind doing this research was also to inform policymakers about the potential development of wind turbines on Lake Erie. I don't know if you have followed this. I have kind of lost track of what's been going on over the past couple of years. I'd be happy to hear from you if there's anything new that's been learned. But certainly at the end of the teens, can we call them that, there was certainly a lot of energy, a lot of state initiative planning on building wind turbines in Lake Erie. There's a big wind turbine thing that was going to go up in Cleveland, and then there was some kind of scandals, and then they shut it down, and then it might have come back. And to be honest with you, I don't know where it is today. I do not know, right? But one has the sense that wind turbines may be inevitable in Ohio's Lake Erie, right? And again, I'm not a policymaker. I'm not an advocate, okay? I just, I play ice hockey and I fool around with bird brains. But that's what I do. But I don't even play ice hockey anymore because my knee is shot. It's over. But what I can say is that if a representative from the government in Columbus came to me and said, okay, based on your research, what can you tell us about the potential hazards of wind turbines in Lake Erie? And I said, look, I can't speak generally, because again, we all want to protect birds, but we all want to turn on the lights, right? Something like that. But what I would say, my strongest recommendation is that if you're going to put turbines in Lake Erie, keep them as far away as possible from the island archipelago. Right? There's clearly a concentration of birds that fly over the island archipelago. Okay? The island archipelago is an important navigational aid, right? The shoreline and the island archipelago. The Western Basin in particular, Western Basin of Lake Erie in particular, is dense with migratory birds. If you want to build turbines, build them 10 miles offshore in Cleveland, right? But stay away from this area because, again, it really is, people think about Northwest Ohio and they giggle a little bit, but the reality is that for 2 weeks, 3 weeks out of the year, we are at the center of the ornithological universe. And at least I, for one, take great pride in that. I eagerly share that pride with other people. And any kind of policy from Columbus that would threaten this brilliant 3 weeks that we have here is nonsensical. Right? If you're asking me, and nobody does, but if you're asking me, that's absolutely nonsensical. I have no idea what time it is. My guess is I probably went over. You guys have been remarkably patient, I think. But I'm done. There you go.
Thank you, Vern. No question.
Sure.
Some of them, low sample size, N of 15, 16. But then there were some like 822,
Right.
454.
So the difference between those in general is the